Here's a few news articles. I was glad to see this. The White House is pushing ahead with research to artificially cool the Earth by injecting something in the upper atmosphere or something like that to reflect more sunlight. I think we really need this. With global warming the way it is, and the sea level rise and the ice caps melting, I'm all for it. I think it's what we need to do. This is pretty amazing. There's this disease called sepsis that they call blood poisoning. You'll have just a minor wound, and sometimes, for no apparent reason, the infection takes hold and your body doesn't fight it off and it kills you in just a few days. And a lot of people die from sepsis, and it turns out it doesn't really have much in the way of any symptoms that a doctor can use or any way to diagnose it. So they keep on not knowing who's got sepsis, and now they have an AI tool that analyzes the medical data, the measurements you have of people, and is very effective at detecting sepsis. So they think it's saving a lot of people already. And this is very rare. Most AI tools are just prototypes, and they run them on historical data to show that in principle they could have done something, but they don't actually do anything. But this is apparently in use now and being used to save lives. So that's good to hear. This one, I was pretty interested. It's relatively close to what I did my PhD thesis on decades ago, and I wonder if they're right about this. But what they claim, they take these two little flakes of metal that are about the size of a human hair. So they're not big, but they're certainly a lot bigger than just a few atoms. And they claim that these two have a vibrational state that is quantum entangled. And my first thought is they're obviously going to have, they show that one of them tends to vibrate opposite the other one. Well, it's obvious to me from this setup that looks kind of like a spring that there will be a simple classical mechanical coupling between the motion of this one and the motion of that one. So I assume they excluded that somehow, although it's not obvious. But anyway, they claim that these things are quantum mechanically entangled, and that's very interesting. If you can get a quantum mechanical effect on such a large object, that may have interesting implications for quantum computing and other things. It's quite surprising that you can measure a quantum effect on such a large object. It does have to be cooled near absolute zero for this to work, but even so. And they measure its motion with reflecting light off it, sort of like radar. So the number 10 and the number 12 largest retailers in the world, the 5th and 10th largest retailers in the country, are going to merge, which is going to pretty much make a monopoly out of grocery stores, I think. I'm amazed if this will be allowed. They want to merge Kroger's and Albertsons, which own Safeway, which would basically make a nationwide monopoly out of grocery stores. And they're claiming it'll lower costs and save money for the consumers, which is what most monopolies do when they're formed. But, you know, I played a game called Monopoly as a kid, and I highly doubt that monopolies lower prices, except just briefly as a scheme to, like, appease regulators. The whole point of a monopoly is that they raise prices because you have no choice. So I certainly hope the government doesn't allow this to happen. But we're going to see. They're trying to do it. And from what I've heard, the FTC is incredibly ineffective, underfunded, and doesn't have enough power these days to block things. So we'll see. So this might affect some of the students. This Biden loan forgiveness that sounded like nonsense to me is apparently really happening. The website is up. And not only that, they say that many people that are qualified, they're just going to get the refund without even applying for it. If the government already knows a lot about your income and everything, so they're going to know, for a lot of people, whether you are borrowed from an eligible program and whether you meet the criteria. So they're just going to let you know that you're getting a refund. You don't have to do anything. But there are some people that need to apply, and they put up a website. They claim they've tested it a lot, so it'll be better than the Obamacare website that crashed when it first went up. So anyway, if anybody needs their student loans forgived, I guess you should try. Might as well take it. I think it's an abuse of power and a questionable economic move for the grand economics, but the fact is it's happening. You might as well take your share of it if you got it coming. One thing about it, which might make it less financially irresponsible than you would think, it's supposedly, $400 billion, enough to wipe out all the so-called savings in the so-called tax reduction plan. But another statement is they were probably not going to get much of that money anyway. Many people default on student loans, so in a way, it may not be costing as much in real terms as you might think. Anyway, I'm amazed. I met a biologist on an airplane a few years ago, and she told me this. When I was a kid, there were these things called the Just So stories, with stories how a tiger went rapidly around a tree with a pail of butter until it mixed the butter into the tiger, and that's why their stripes turned yellow. And there's these old folk tales about how parents have an experience and all their children inherit that experience. And then the science in all my life was saying that doesn't happen. What happens is you inherit the DNA, and the DNA does not record anything about the experience of the parents. But apparently that is not true. There is something called epigenetic inheritance. So you have the DNA, but there are things on the outside of the proteins of the DNA which that's like on and off switches that control which sections of the DNA get used. And those you can inherit. And they have now shown this. Things like diet, weight, and stress can be passed from fathers to offspring, despite them not being in the DNA. They're in these epigenetic things. So that's pretty interesting. And they've it's a real thing. I heard about it a few years ago, and it was amazing to me. So that's makes the world a little more complicated than I thought. So China uses drone to stop wildfires. They have these drones with, I guess, a tank of water or some kind of chemical, and they use them to put out the fires. This actually seems like a whole lot better idea than, dropping humans with axes out of helicopters and getting convicts to fight fires because it's dangerous. And they say that China has a very good army of firefighting drones, and for some reason we don't. Although it probably would be a really good idea. So anyway, it's interesting to know. And there are more and more of these stories where China is ahead of us. A few decades ago, we were always ahead of China. That's certainly not true anymore. So this is pretty amazing. There's some laws. China actually uses fire suppression rockets. Oh, well, that's a good idea, actually. Now that you mention it, why don't we just send sort of a bomb that will blow up and, I don't know, spray chemicals or water? Yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know why we're not doing those things. Anyway, this is an amazing thing. In order to prevent people from having to get housing and having to live with criminals, they passed laws for crime-free housing. And the way the law works is if anyone in your family commits a crime, they evict you, even if they don't do it on the where you live, and they don't even live with you. So this is bizarre. This woman's mother lived somewhere, and one of her daughters stole something, even though she didn't live there, and so now she gets evicted. So this is pretty disturbing, and they're saying it has now been declared legal by, I think, the Supreme Court, a court, maybe not the Supreme Court yet, but it's this is punishing you for something somebody else did that may have nothing to do with you, and it would seem to violate some fundamental principles of guilt and innocence. But anyway, so none of those interesting things. Another similar thing that is really head scratcher is the one where the cops just take your stuff. They can stop your car and say, "Oh, this car looks too expensive. We're just taking it. And you have too much money. We're just taking that." They just take it and spend it. And you don't have to ever convict you of a crime or even charge you with a crime. They can just say, "We rule that this is probably the result of a crime," and asset forfeiture, they call it. That's been going on for a long time, and that's another crazy thing. It seems like it shouldn't be permitted at all, but it's really going on. So this one was pretty surprising. I've been hearing a lot about this bring your own vulnerable driver attack. We've talked about a few examples, I think. A manufacturer of hardware will make a driver, and the driver will have a flaw. And then they'll probably update the driver, but there exists an old driver that's signed with a flaw. And you can make malware that installs that old driver and then uses the flaw. And the old drivers are typically not revoked. And so Microsoft claimed for years that they had a revocation list for dangerous drivers. And they talked to people. They said, "Oh, yes, we've got this revocation list. We're blocking the drivers." And they just found out that for years, they've never updated the database. So their tool to supposedly do this has just been broken for years, and they've been lying about it. So because people say, why do we keep able to use these vulnerable drivers that have been known about for years, and this supposed so-called tool is not blocking them? Well, because the tool is just broken, and the updates were not broken. So that's an embarrassment for Microsoft. But anyway, at least now they've finally figured out what's going on, and I think Microsoft has now finally rolled out some updates for that tool. There's some training products that someone recommended that were pretty good. This one here, Blue Team Labs Online. You can make an account here and you can practice defensive activities, which are interesting. Might want to check that out. And here's free Splunk training, which is also probably good. So if I get what I asked for, I'll be teaching CNET 50 next semester, and that is Splunk certification, and we will probably use some of this free Splunk training if it looks appropriate. I'll look into it, and I may incorporate it in my class. What I did before was use the previous generation of free Splunk training, so I'll try and figure out if this is the right thing to use. I imagine it probably is. I do whatever will take you to the Splunk certification, which I highly recommend. A ridiculously easy test, but certainly a good thing to have on your resume to say that you know the official recommended stuff about Splunk. All right, I'm going to stop this video.